In 1811, a frontier lawyer and future congressman, Henry Brackenridge, was in the city of St. Louis after traveling up the Mississippi River. Thanks to the Louisiana Purchase by Thomas Jefferson, this was the edge of the new frontier. Indeed, Lewis and Clark's expedition had only just returned to the city 4 years earlier, and Brackenridge made a point to document everything about his journey up the river. In doing so, Brackenridge noted a discovery that astonished him. He wrote in his journal,
I crossed the Mississippi at St. Louis, and after passing through the wood which borders the river, about a half a mile in width, entered an extensive open plain. In 15 minutes, I found myself in the midst of a group of mounds, mostly of a circular shape, and at a distance resembling enormous haystacks scattered through a meadow. One of the largest which I ascended was about 200 paces in circumference at the bottom, the form nearly square, though it had evidently undergone considerable alteration from the washing of the rains. The top was level, with an area sufficient to contain several hundred men. Around me, I counted 20 mounds, or pyramids, besides a great number of small artificial elevations. Pursuing my walk along the bank of the Cahokia, I passed 8 others in the distance of 3 miles before I arrived at the principal assemblage. When I reached the foot of the largest mound, I was struck with a degree of astonishment not unlike that which is experienced in contemplating the Egyptian pyramids, and could not help exclaiming, "What a stupendous pile of earth! To heap up such a mass must have required years and the labors of thousands. Were it not for the regularity and design which it manifests, the circumstance of its being on alluvial ground, and the other mounds scattered around it, we could scarcely believe it the work of human hands."
What had stunned Brackenridge was the remains of the great ancient city of Cahokia. He would later write to Thomas Jefferson about the site and publish an article in the local St. Louis press. Incredibly, his published accounts of it appear to have been completely ignored by the locals, which is a shame because the site would suffer greatly for it. As Brackenridge could plainly see, Cahokia was the greatest city built north of Mexico, and in its heyday, it was a city of over 120 mounds, arranged in large plazas housing a population of 10 to 20,000 people, with thousands of additional people living in the hinterland. The story behind the rise of Cahokia is not just the story of a great city, but the story of a cultural explosion that transformed eastern North America. Let's check it out. Cahokia lies along the Mississippi, across from the modern-day city of St. Louis, and that's not a coincidence. For any of you not very familiar with the Gateway to the West, St. Louis sits right where the Missouri drains into the Mississippi River. Not only is this area blessed with an abundance of natural resources, but these rivers make it ideal for the transport of people and goods. Making this even more appealing is that at the confluence of the two rivers is a wide floodplain, called the American Bottom. In case you find that term strange, bottom used to be a common term for floodplains, and in this instance, it stuck around, so cut out that snickering. This is history. We are serious. These floodplains made the area very fertile and well-suited for agriculture. Now, Cahokia didn't just pop up out of nowhere. For most of its history, Cahokia was a larger woodland settlement that had been inhabited since 700 CE. Woodland culture had developed out of the Archaic around 800 BCE in eastern North America, and was characterized by small settlements practicing agriculture, hunting, fishing, and foraging. Late woodland communities were fairly insular, and for the most part there wasn't much interaction between settlements. By the time Cahokia was founded, or Old Cahokia as it's referred to in the late woodland period, the times were changing. After the introduction of the bow and arrow from the west around 700 CE, give or take, communities began to increasingly cluster in villages, which necessitated an increased reliance on agriculture. During this time, Old Cahokia was a larger woodland settlement, and after about 900 CE, it began to grow steadily as more and more people moved in. By the way, the name Cahokia is not the original indigenous name. The name actually comes from the tribe that was living there when the French first explored the area. The original indigenous name has unfortunately been lost to time. Because of the floodplains, Cahokia had plenty of productive and fertile land for crops, especially maize. Maize, or corn as English speakers colloquially call it, was far more productive than anything else woodland peoples had previously cultivated. That's not to say that maize hadn't been around in the late woodland period. It was there, but it was farmed sparingly, and it wasn't a staple crop. It's not until the late woodland, early Mississippian period that this changes. This may be because, in part, at 950 CE, the medieval warm period began and turned the American bottom into a warmer and wetter area that allowed maize crops to thrive. So just to recap, at 1000 CE, Cahokia was a prosperous settlement steadily growing in size and farming maize more and more intensively in a very fertile area. Longtime viewers of this channel should know that when maize begins to take off, things have a tendency to change profoundly, and I'll just say now that you won't be disappointed here. Around 1050, for reasons that are not entirely understood, everything at Cahokia changed abruptly. This is one of those moments where we can only frustratingly speculate at what caused such an incredible change. Perhaps some charismatic leader inspired other Cahokians with a vision. Maybe Cahokia reached a tipping point in food surplus and population and had to reorganize. Dr. Timothy Paucatat has theorized that the appearance of the supernova SN 1054, which was recorded worldwide in the year 1054, may have been seen as a cosmic sign by the Cahokian leadership, and perhaps this was a catalyst in the justification of the new order. While this is very speculative and unprovable, it is, I think, an interesting coincidence. By the way, if you have a telescope, you can still see the remains of this terrific supernova when you zoom into the Crab Nebula. Nearly 1,000 years ago, that thing would have been visible in the daylight. Whatever the reason, seemingly out of nowhere, Cahokia exploded in size, and I do not exaggerate. Old Cahokia had a population of perhaps 2,000 people during the late woodland, but it would grow to a city of more than 10,000 in just decades. To accommodate this sudden swell in population, the site underwent a complete redesign. Old Cahokia was razed, and in its place, a new planned city began to take shape that would be dominated by huge mounds, plazas, and causeways. These changes were so startlingly abrupt that it shouldn't come as a surprise to learn that archaeologists refer to this moment as the Big Bang of Cahokia. Now let's get out our magnifying glasses and dissect this Big Bang. First of all, who was migrating to Cahokia, and why? If we look at the early pottery at the site, we can gain some insight into this. Early pottery at Cahokia is fairly diverse in style, which means that people from outside the area were moving in and taking their cultural traditions with them. Among them, people of the Coles Creek culture in modern Louisiana and Plum Bayou culture in modern Arkansas. Cahokia-style pottery even shows up at some of those sites as well, showing that there were older connections. A good example of this migration can be seen in the decline of the impressive Toltec Mound site in central Arkansas. Now, just to clear something up, especially for you Mesoamerican enthusiasts out there, there's no connection between the Toltec Mound site in Arkansas and the Toltec Empire in Mexico. That's a modern name, and one that shows us that enthusiastic archaeologists of ages past did not always come up with the most clear and precise names. Oh well. The Toltec Mound site was abandoned around 1050, just as Cahokia was starting to take off, and it's likely that many of the inhabitants made their way up the river to find a new home in Cahokia. Like any great urban settlement, Cahokia was taking in new people from near and far. These people would have also brought their own rituals, traditions, and political organization. Cahokia was likely a multi-ethnic and multilingual melting pot of people. As Cahokia grew, it spilled across the river through modern-day East St. Louis and into St. Louis. But sadly, almost nothing remains of the great mounds of the St. Louis and East St. Louis sites. They've since been leveled and swallowed up by urban sprawl. Besides those, other satellite communities have been documented all over Cahokia's hinterland. Some of these were brand new settlements, and others were previous woodland settlements that were absorbed into the Cahokian sphere. Now that we have a rough idea of who was coming into Cahokia, let's look at the why. As I mentioned earlier, Cahokia's floodplains offered a fantastic location for farming. It was also ideally located for trade and transport since it was very close to the confluence of the Mississippi and Missouri rivers. And yet, there are other floodplains along the Mississippi and other similar confluences, but there was only one Cahokia. Why was that? It turns out Cahokia was much more than just a tidy spot to settle on the river. It was forging a new, vibrant, and appealing culture, which likely played an important role in drawing in people from afar. The Big Bang was just as much a cultural shift as it was a demographic one. Cahokia wasn't just a big city, it was the center of a new order, a Mississippian order. These sudden changes touched almost every aspect of life, and they can be seen in everything from houses, pottery, art, consumption, and burials. Let's take a quick look at some of these changes. A good example of this is in the construction of houses. Previously, woodland houses had been constructed by digging individual post holes before inserting posts and constructing the rest of the house. Suddenly, Cahokians ditched this method and began digging wall trenches to build houses. This allowed workers to prefabricate walls on the ground before setting them into the trench, perfect for planning and quick construction. These are a trademark of Cahokian and later Mississippian culture. Also, a distinct style of pottery called Rami-incised pottery emerges as the signature style at Cahokia. These were clay pots created with a shell temper and incised with sticks, reeds, stone, or bone implements. These incised designs show a rich cosmology through a variety of cosmograms. These pots served as both domestic as well as ritual functions and were so prized by people outside of Cahokia that foreigners imitated and adopted this style. Another important element of Cahokia was the game of chunky. What is chunky, you may be asking? Chunky was a game played by rolling a puck-like chunky stone across the ground. Two players with long javelin-like sticks would gauge the roll and path of the stone and throw their sticks as close to the stone's final resting point as possible. Think of it like horseshoes, except you have to throw the horseshoe at a moving stake. This game held very important ritual significance to Cahokia and to later Mississippian people, but it was also a beloved spectator sport, and later historical accounts state that it was even rife with gambling. Something to note about chunky and Cahokia is that a distinct style of chunky stone was developed at Cahokia, which is characterized by a polished concave stone disc. You can see examples of these here. These chunky stones are going to be an important calling card of Cahokia. In art, there are unique naturalistic flint clay statues of culture heroes, gods, and goddesses that provide tantalizing glimpses into Cahokian mythology. Along with these beautiful works of art, a new style and elaboration of art and iconography began to germinate at Cahokia that would be exported far abroad. This style is referred to as the SECC, the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex. Now, that term is a bit of a misnomer because when it was coined back in the 1940s, the southeastern United States was seen as the epicenter of this complex, but we now know that the SECC had its origins around the Mississippi. Now, I do want to note that some of these symbols and motifs do have pre-Mississippian antecedents, but we shouldn't automatically assume that their meaning and application remained constant. Like many other cultural symbols across the world, they were likely developed, elaborated, and perhaps even reinvented by Cahokia, but we'll get into more detail on that later. What's important is that Cahokia was pioneering a vibrant new way of life. To people who had grown up in small, isolated woodland settlements, Cahokia must have seemed like an alluring and grand experiment full of wonder. With all that under our belts, let's take a look at the landscape of Cahokia. When Cahokia was planned out, it was laid out on an orthogonal design, offset about 5 degrees from true north. The reason for this offset is not understood, but it's clear that the city's layout adheres to this axis. With this master plan, the people of Cahokia built mounds the scale of which had never been seen before or since. Atop these mounds would have been elite houses, community buildings, and religious shrines and temples. Before we start diving into the features of the site, we need to make a few distinctions between the different types of mounds. There are 3 types of mounds at the site: platform mounds, conical mounds, and ridgetop mounds. Platform mounds were flat-topped mounds that would have been topped with a building of some type. These types of mounds are nothing new, and there are similar mounds at earlier sites, such as the Toltec Mound site we discussed earlier. Conical mounds also have some historical precedent as well from earlier cultures, particularly from Hopewell and Adena sites. These are believed to have been burial mounds for local elites, but may have had other functions too. The last type of mound at the site, ridgetop mounds, are a Cahokia original. With perhaps 1 or 2 exceptions, they are not found anywhere else in the eastern United States. These mounds get their name from the pointed roof-shaped top that they have, although today these mound tops have been eroded and smoothed over by the march of time. Now that we have that out of the way, let's look at the site in more detail and start at the most prominent feature, Monk's Mound. If you're curious about where the name comes from, it's because Trappist monks settled at the site in the 18th century. Its construction actually began in the days of Old Cahokia around 950 CE, and over the centuries it grew bigger and bigger until the final construction phase at about 1150. The mound is the largest pyramid north of Mesoamerica, rising to a height of 30 meters with a base of 291 meters by 236 meters. And let me tell you, the view from the top will take your breath away. Literally. I can tell you from personal experience that it's a long climb and you'll be huffing and puffing when you reach the top. The mound is aligned to the city's north-south axis like other monuments at the site. It had a total of 4 terraces, which you can see here. These would have had their own buildings on top of them. There's compelling evidence to suggest that the second terrace was once part of the summit that collapsed and then was refinished in its current position. At the mound's summit would have stood a large structure, most likely an elite residence of the Cahokian leader. Excavations have uncovered post holes and wall remains which can give us a vague idea of the building's dimensions. Building the mound was a truly colossal undertaking. All the earth for this mound would have been moved by hand and transported in baskets and piled up slowly but surely. And don't get the idea that people were just piling up dirt. Cores taken from the mound show that specific soils and clays were used in different layers, and these likely had both structural as well as aesthetic purposes. For example, clay layers were probably added to aid in runoff. Recent estimates have put the volume of the entire structure at 740,000 cubic meters, or 26 million cubic feet. That's a lot of dirt. Probably too much, actually, because despite all that care and engineering, the mound has unfortunately suffered from sagging and erosion. Turns out that earth piled that high does not always like to stay in place. Even today, Monk's Mound requires maintenance to combat this and to preserve its shape. If you're curious where all the dirt for this and the other mounds came from, it was dug locally, and you can actually see the remains of those pits today. These barrow pits form depressions in the landscape, and many of them have become small ponds. To the west of Monk's Mound is another important but sometimes overlooked part of the Cahokian landscape, the woodhenge. Now, we've seen woodhenges on this channel before. One of the earliest examples we already covered at Poverty Point, and such monuments were also erected by the later Hopewell culture in the first centuries of the Common Era. Like its ancient and distant ancestors, the woodhenge was a series of wooden posts, likely around 6 meters tall, arranged in a circle. The monument was constructed to observe astronomical events, particularly the equinoxes and solstices. The woodhenge was first built around 1100 CE, and was actually rebuilt several times over the next century in slightly different sizes, ranging from 73 meters in diameter to 145 meters at its largest arrangement. The placement to the west of Monk's Mound is not a coincidence. From the center point of the woodhenge, the equinox sun would have risen from the center of Monk's Mound, which would have been powerfully symbolic. While we're on the west side, let's push a little further. Until the 1930s, the second tallest mound at the site stood there, the Powell Mound. The story of the Powell Mound is a tragic tale, and one that's shared by many a mound, not just at Cahokia, but in East St. Louis and St. Louis as well. The mound was originally a huge ridge-top mound about 94 meters long and over 13 meters high. The state of Illinois had actually made an effort to purchase the mound from the Powell family, but the family had not been wanting to sell unless the entire property was bought, a prospect that the state was unwilling or unable to do at the time. The Powell family had also offered to allow excavation of the mound for a rather large fee, but at the time, the lack of finance failed to bring about any such work. Little public interest also prevented additional funds from being raised. Fearing that eminent domain would be used, the family hired a company to level the mound via steam shovel to fill in a low depression nearby. Incidentally, that depression was likely the source of all the mound's dirt. In December of 1930, archaeologists could only watch in horror as the mound was carted away. Archaeologists were able to make some quick observations and note some burials, but not much else. With almost no public outcry, the second largest mound at the site was lost forever. But let's get back to the monuments that are still there. South of Monk's Mound would have been the Grand Plaza. Excavations have shown that this expanse was meticulously leveled out, smoothed, and topped with a sandy soil to provide solid footing. In some places, as much as 3 feet of earth had to be added to achieve this. The Grand Plaza was likely used for public rituals, feasts, games, dancing, and other public gatherings. The space was especially fine-tuned for public speaking, and reportedly the acoustics are good enough that you can hear a good speaker from the top of Monk's Mound on a quiet day. Commerce may have also occurred here, but that's still debated. One important and iconic activity that would have happened here was chunky games. The plaza provided a perfect surface for the sport. The plaza is interrupted by a few smaller mounds that likely contained buildings and burials. As impressive as the Grand Plaza is, it's not the only plaza at the site. There are also plazas to the north, east, and west that likely served similar functions as the Grand Plaza. These 4 plazas likely represented the cardinal directions, which were very important to Mississippian cosmology, and this design likely signified the 4 corners of the earth. This theme is also represented in ancient art as a cross in the middle of a circle. On the eastern side, there's actually a second plaza that was likely constructed after the palisade was built in the middle of the eastern plaza, but we'll talk more about that later. Of particular interest in this area is Mound 34, which was constructed near the end of the 11th century. This mound was excavated back in the 50s, and it turned up a variety of SECC artifacts from all over the Mississippian world, such as engraved whelk shells and effigy shark teeth from the Gulf Coast, arrowheads from Arkansas, and even the remains of a copper workshop. To the south of the Grand Plaza are 2 of the larger mounds at the site, the Twin Mounds. Mound 59 is a conical mound about 12 meters tall that is believed to have been a mortuary mound. Mound 60 right next door is over 12 meters high and likely held an elite residence or possibly a charnel house on top. If you're curious what a charnel house is, it's a structure meant to inter the dead before a later burial. There are actually historical accounts from later Mississippian cultures that document instances of charnel houses on raised platforms near conical burial mounds, and it's possible that this is what we're seeing here. While researching this, I was really surprised to find that very little excavation has been done on these mounds, so there isn't much archaeology to discuss. But that's not the case with our next stop, because just beyond the Twin Mounds lies what is debatably the most important mound at the site in archaeological terms, the excitingly named Mound 72. Mound 72 is a ridgetop mound that has been reduced by centuries of erosion and plowing. At first, no one really bothered to give it much attention, and it's not hard to see why. It's not even 2 meters in height, and I even once read in a book that one of the first maps of the site left it completely off. But don't let first impressions fool you. There is so much written on this that I could have made an entire episode about Mound 72 alone. In 1967, archaeologist Melvin Fowler first excavated the mound. He was actually interested in the mound because he noticed that it lined up perfectly with the equinoxes rather than Cahokia's grid, and that the center line from Monk's Mound went directly through it. He predicted that there would be a marker post lined up to that center line. Incredibly, he found what he was looking for. There was a post, which was actually part of an earlier woodhenge dating all the way back to Old Cahokia. The woodhenge was terminated with the rest of Old Cahokia, and the mound was eventually built over the northeast section of the former woodhenge so that it aligned with the summer solstice sunset and the winter solstice sunrise. As cool as that is, it's not even the most interesting part of Mound 72, not by a long shot. Unbeknownst to Fowler and his team, the mound had been constructed over a few smaller burial mounds that contained elite burials. These burials were made over several decades, and they were likely venerated long after by their descendants. The most prominent burial excavated contained a man buried on a blanket of over 20,000 shell beads from the Gulf Coast, all in the shape of a falcon or thunderbird. In this beaded burial, as it was later called, there were a few copper tablets, mica sheets, chunky stones, and hundreds of arrowheads. Several other burials were also interred with him, possibly his retainers or kin. To this day, this is one of the richest burials ever found in the United States. It's very impressive on its own. But things took a grisly turn when archaeologists unearthed some sacrificed bodies in the mounds. And not just a few of them, no. Mound 72 has over 270 bodies interred in it. Most of them were sacrificed. Some of them even appear to have been buried alive. Yikes. A large number of these sacrificial victims were young women in their late teens and early 20s. Now, some instances of human sacrifice in the eastern United States were documented by settlers, notably among the Pawnee and the Natchez peoples, but these instances never approached the dramatic scale seen at Mound 72. Sacrifice on this scale was completely unknown north of Mesoamerica, but it was happening at Cahokia, and it shows the power that the elites commanded over the local population. Another interesting thing about many of the female victims is that we know from dental and bone analysis that they were not eating particularly well. They were subsisting primarily on maize, which probably means that they came from a poor background. We can also tell from strontium analysis that many of them were not local. It's unknown if these women were attendants, slaves, captives, or people offered up as tribute from outer satellite communities. What is typically agreed upon is that this ritualized violence was part of an elaborate political and ritual theater meant to aggrandize elites and impress commoners. Even more interesting is that these burials date from the very beginning of New Cahokia, around 1050 CE. Even before the great mounds were raised, the politics at Cahokia were incredibly complex, its leaders immensely powerful. And Mound 72 isn't an isolated instance. It's just the best and most thoroughly studied instance. It actually follows a pattern among other ridgetop mounds at the site. Sadly, many of these have been destroyed and were only hastily excavated in salvage operations long ago, before modern techniques in carbon dating were available. However, these salvage excavations did confirm that these were mortuary mounds buried with honored dead as well as other sacrificial victims. And while we're on the topic of ridgetop mounds, let's look at the largest one that still survives. At the very south of Cahokia is Mound 66, affectionately called the Rattlesnake Mound for the pit viper nests that long infested it, and presumably warded off would-be exploits by Indiana Jones. By length, this ridgetop mound is the second largest mound at the site. It measures about 150 by 60 meters and has a height of about 9 to 10 meters. It was built along an east-west axis instead of the north-south axis. The mound was originally excavated back in the 1920s by Warren King Moorhead, and some 140 burials were found inside, but they were in a very poor state of preservation. Excavations also showed that this mound was built up fairly quickly, but I've never seen any solid dating of this mound in my research. Some have speculated from the mound's fill that this mound may have been one of the earliest structures at Cahokia from which the site was laid out. What makes this idea even more intriguing is that the Rattlesnake Mound is connected to Monk's Mound by a large causeway running along the main axis of the site, which was likely a ceremonial procession path. There are many other mounds and features we could talk about, but we've got a lot more to cover. If you're interested in the nitty-gritty details, I'd recommend picking up a copy of William Eisminger's book, Cahokia Mounds, America's First City. He'll gladly take you through the weeds and turn over every stone at the site for you. It's a good read, even for the interested layman. You don't have to be an archaeologist to enjoy it. Now that we have a good idea of what Cahokia looked like, let's discuss what life would have been like there. A city this big needs food, and agriculture was central to Cahokia's existence. We already know that maize was the primary staple crop and an important part of the diet, but it wasn't the only star of the show. The eastern woodlands had long had its own agricultural tradition, which is referred to in the literature as the Eastern Agricultural Complex. This made use of such plants as squash, sunflower, little barley, maygrass, marsh elder, and knotweed, and Cahokia continued cultivating these crops. The Eastern Agricultural Complex is definitely worth more in-depth treatment, but that's for another episode. Interestingly, beans were never cultivated at Cahokia, and they only appear in the archaeological record after Cahokia declines. Along with this, small and large game, fish, and waterfowl were also hunted to provide meat. Farms and satellite communities spread out into the hinterland around Cahokia to help feed this huge population. The average Cahokian lived in a wattle and daub house with a semi-subterranean foundation and a thatched roof. As I mentioned earlier, these are easy to spot in the archaeological record because these houses all had wall trenches. You can easily see their outlines in the earth if you dig down. By the way, for those who aren't familiar with the term wattle and daub, it's a method of construction where a lattice of wood and sticks is covered with some type of soil or sand or clay mixture. It's a fairly common method of house construction seen all over the ancient world, not just at Cahokia. Certain houses or structures also featured a T-shaped design, but the function of these buildings isn't fully understood. Houses would have been constructed around a small plaza or courtyard. Another feature of neighborhoods would have been the circular sweat baths in which people would have ritually cleansed themselves. Outside of Cahokia proper, people would have lived in smaller satellite communities which were organized and constructed in the same manner as Cahokia's neighborhoods. Population estimates for Cahokia proper vary a bit, but most scholars agree that 15,000 is a reasonable estimate, with thousands more living in suburban communities. People at Cahokia were bonded by important cultural practices and ceremonies. First and most obvious among these was the construction of the site's mounds. You may wonder why people would have signed up for this backbreaking work, but there's actually a telling clue in the garbage pits that have been excavated at the site. Yes, garbage pits, archaeological gold mines. You see, Cahokians were repeatedly feasting within the city. Remains of deer, grouse, fish, fruit, stews, tobacco seeds, and broken dishes in huge numbers show that the people of Cahokia were partying hard. These feasts were probably associated closely with larger ceremonies, chunky games, and the redistribution of local surplus to allies. Those Ramian-sized pots we described earlier were likely given away at such ceremonies to visitors from near and far. The local crowds attracted to this would have constituted a huge labor force. Underpinning all of this ceremony and labor, however, was religion, and this was vital to ancient life at Cahokia. Reconstructing early Mississippian religion is challenging, but by combining archaeology with what historical accounts tell us of later indigenous people of eastern North America, we can draw some conclusions. I'm going to be highlighting the elements that we can really pin down at Cahokia. Mississippian beliefs and mythology really deserves its own episode. That said, one important figure in later Mississippian mythology is the Birdman, or Thunderbird. These figures are usually depicted as warriors with a beaked nose and striped eyes. Examples of birdmen can be found at Cahokia, most famously on this tablet excavated from Monk's Mound. But recall the beaded burial in Mound 72. The beaded cape was fashioned in the shape of a falcon, and it might be the case that the elites at the city made efforts to associate themselves with the Thunderbird. Another figure that appears in Cahokian art is the Mississippian culture hero Redhorn, sometimes known by the longer but much more descriptive name He Who Wears Human Head Earrings. Actually, human head earrings with long noses, an important feature of Redhorn's appearance, hence the name, have been found at and around Cahokia. Later historical accounts of Mississippian peoples also note an association with their chiefs and the sun, and this dovetails rather nicely with the woodhenge alignments that we saw earlier. Remember, from the woodhenge, the rise of the summer equinox would have been seen coming from Monk's Mound, likely from the chief's own house. It would have been some powerful symbolism. Another series of artifacts that can cue us into Cahokian beliefs are the female flint clay figurines that we mentioned earlier. These figurines depict female figures, perhaps mother goddesses or earth goddesses, and what is most interesting is that they're usually depicted with crops. In some instances, these crops literally sprout from their bodies. What role these goddesses played in Cahokian beliefs is not entirely certain, but they were likely linked with agricultural fertility, especially when we consider that most of these figurines were recovered from the city's periphery, its breadbasket, so to speak, rather than within the city itself. Speaking of agriculture, the intensification of maize farming may have had an impact on religion. Anyone who's ever grown maize knows that it's a demanding crop that needs the right amount of water at the right time, so it shouldn't come as a surprise that water and rain became an important element to Cahokian religion, and there's some interesting evidence for this. 24 kilometers east of Cahokia is the Emerald Site, a small mound site that once housed a religious complex near a natural spring. Excavations show that this site was built up as Cahokia rose in prominence and power. It's also marked by the lunar alignments of the mounds, so we can see an emphasis not just on water, but the moon too. The Emerald Site was an important location for Cahokian ritual because a processional causeway connecting it to Cahokia was recently discovered. This was likely used as a pilgrimage route for important lunar events. Even more interesting at the site is that many of the buildings show termination rituals and even a human sacrifice involving water. This is compelling evidence that water held power and sanctity, and we're going to see what happens later when that water begins to diminish. incomplete as this picture is, we can still get an idea of a very rich spiritual and cultural life that everyone at Cahokia would have participated in. Let's take a step back and look at the wider picture. Cahokia was a juggernaut, and its influence over the emerging Mississippian world was nothing short of incredible. Traces of Cahokia's influence can be seen as far south as Louisiana, as far north as Wisconsin, as far west as Oklahoma, and as far east as Georgia. One easy way to see this is through trade. I should note here that most archaeologists believe that commerce was not central to Cahokia's prosperity or influence or appeal, but it still played a role nonetheless. Exotic materials such as marine shells from the Gulf Coast, mica and quartz crystal from the Appalachians, sandstone from Wisconsin, and copper from the Great Lakes were transported to Cahokia. Finished materials such as arrowheads, axes, blades, and exotic pottery have also been found at Cahokia, though they're not very common. Coming from Cahokia were Ramey incised pots, long-nosed god ear ornaments, Cahokia-style chunky stones, flint clay statuettes, and Cahokia-style points and tools. This exchange might look like everyday trade, but this is actually part of a far larger cultural intrusion by Cahokia into the lands beyond. Nowhere is this more pronounced than the northern Mississippi. Around 1100, northern sites from western Wisconsin all the way to southeastern South Dakota show unmistakable evidence of contact with Cahokia and a resulting cultural shift. The exact reasons for this are debated. It's possible that colonists from Cahokia migrated north and established new Cahokia-style settlements, or that people from northern territories visited Cahokia and brought back with them new ideas that transformed their homeland. Regardless, this transformation was rapid, just like the Big Bang had been at Cahokia. Mississippian culture bursts onto the scene and just subsumes previous cultures. The best example of this is the Aztlan site in southern Wisconsin. And no, there's no relation to the mythical Aztlan or the Aztecs, so don't ask me in the comments. Just another case of poor naming. Prior to 1050, the locals here had built effigy mounds like other people in southern Wisconsin and eastern Iowa. After 1050, Aztlan suddenly emerges as a Cahokia-style settlement with mounds, plazas, wall trench houses, and Cahokia-style artifacts. Local styles still continued, but the fact that they're mixed up with Cahokia artifacts shows that this was a sudden intrusion very early in Cahokia's history and not a gradual change. It really brings into focus the influence Cahokia wielded. Aztlan is not an isolated example. To the south, Cahokian influence can clearly be seen from Spiro in Oklahoma to Shiloh in Tennessee, just to name a few specific locations. By 1300, Mississippian culture had diffused all over the southern United States and upper Midwest, and Cahokia played a huge role in legitimizing this new order. As glorious as Cahokia was, it couldn't last forever. Already at 1100, the gap between upper and lower classes began to widen, and factionalism was probably increasing. However, this is actually the period where we can date most of the site's mound construction. This construction spree likely displaced many people from their homes as new mounds and wood henges were constructed. When new houses were constructed, they paid less attention to the city's grid layout. During this time, there doesn't seem to be any signs of internal conflict. By 1150, however, there were signs that Cahokia was beginning to face serious challenges. The most glaring change is the huge palisade Cahokia built to enclose about 200 acres of the central precinct. This wooden daub-covered palisade was over 2,800 meters long and between 3 and 4.5 meters high. Bastions and L-shaped gates were stationed at regular intervals along the palisade. The construction of these fortifications represented an enormous expenditure of labor and resources. It's estimated that 15,000 to 20,000 logs would have been needed for the palisade. And if you think that's where it ends, you're in for a surprise, because that palisade was built and rebuilt 4 times during Cahokia's history. Although no evidence for an attack on Cahokia has ever been found, these walls were clearly a high priority. And it shows that Cahokia had enemies, most likely other Mississippians. Warfare was becoming a concern, and not just at Cahokia. This trend is mirrored all over the wider Mississippian world. At Aztlan, for example, an equally impressive palisade was erected around this same time. The palisade at Cahokia would have also had profound social consequences, because it cut directly through neighborhoods and public spaces. Those living within the walls were clearly differentiated from those living outside, although they still would have been allowed inside for public events and ceremonies as well as when the city was under attack. Even more alarming than the erection of the fortifications was the fact that the population was beginning to shrink by 1200. In the decades after 1200, Cahokia was severely depopulated and only had a population of about 3,000 to 4,500, down from its peak population of perhaps 15,000 people. Whatever appeal Cahokia had had 2 centuries earlier had faded, and people were now leaving in droves. Without a large population to support it, Cahokia imploded like a star at the end of its life. By 1350, the city was completely abandoned, as well as most of the American bottom. What caused this precipitous decline? Unfortunately, Cahokia's decline and its final demise are just as mysterious as its rise. Many causes have been suggested, and we'll take a look at these real quick. First, and perhaps most common, is that Cahokia's incredible population depleted its local resources. In particular, forests would have been felled in huge numbers for construction material and firewood. Remember, the palisade alone would have required huge amounts of lumber. Archaeologists have speculated since the 90s that this mistake would have resulted in erosion and localized flooding episodes that would have catastrophically wiped out young crops. However, in recent years, this theory has been reevaluated and challenged by recent archaeological work at Cahokia, which has shown that no such flooding occurred. Others have pointed out that changes in climate and drought episodes had an impact not just on Cahokian harvests, but on people's faith in the leadership. According to these proponents, the end of the medieval warm period in 1200 CE and a series of prior droughts had had a calamitous impact on the local agriculture, and that this in turn discredited the Cahokian leadership's ability to intercede with the gods. This could have possibly coincided with a wider political decline as well. Former satellite communities might have broken away from Cahokia's control, depriving Cahokia of their resources. Others have suggested that warfare and conflict contributed to Cahokia's fall. Obviously, warfare and conflict were a concern of later Cahokians because they went to huge lengths to fortify their city. As I mentioned earlier, no direct evidence of warfare exists at Cahokia, though warfare would become rampant among Mississippians in the post-Cahokian world. However, at the nearby East St. Louis site, salvage archaeology has revealed that much of the site was burned down around the same time that the fortifications in Cahokia were going up. Whether this was the result of an attack or an accident is unknown. An interesting coincidence, but hardly a smoking gun. Some have suggested that Cahokia's huge, dense population was at a higher risk of disease due to the effects of poor sanitation, a challenge faced by all ancient urban populations worldwide. And indeed, there is some evidence to suggest that as Cahokia grew, the health of the common people suffered. Whatever the case, Cahokia was a ghost town by 1350. You may be wondering what happened to the tens of thousands of people that had formerly populated Cahokia and its hinterland. Although it's impossible to trace the descendants of Cahokia with certainty, it's likely that the ancestors of later Siouan speakers, such as the Osage, the Kansa, the Ponca, the Quapaw, and the Omaha, likely migrated from the American bottom to the west and south. With them, they took those hallmarks of Cahokia's culture, like chunky, urban planning, and its ceremonial and political practices. This emigration was so complete that the American bottom was nearly emptied of all serious habitation until about 1500. Oddly, however, no surviving oral histories speak about Cahokia or anything like it, and I have personally found this very puzzling. How could such an incredible time in history not be remembered in legend? I think, however, it's important to remember that just because we admire a moment in time doesn't always mean that people who lived through it did. Cahokia may have been something imperfect or even oppressive that people didn't care to remember. Or perhaps oral histories did survive for centuries only to fade later. We'll never know. And that's going to wrap us up for today, and I appreciate you sticking around to the end. This video was a blast to make from start to finish. This was the first episode where I covered a site that I have personally visited, and I can't recommend it enough. If you're ever passing through St. Louis on I-70 or I-55, do yourself a favor, pull over, climb Monk's Mound, walk the site, and visit the museum. If you've made it this far through the episode, you won't regret it. Special thanks to my patrons listed here. You guys are the best. If you would like to join the ranks of these fine individuals and support the show, you can do so on Patreon. The link will be in the description below. Don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Facebook. Take care, and we'll see you in our next episode.